distinguished lectures and public programs put together so ably by Patrick Kennedy and Nikolai DiPippa. And today's program is personally very important to me, number one, because I very much admire the person who is speaking. Number two, his efforts to put together the joint degree that exists between the Bowen Law School and the Clinton School, JD MPS joint degree, have proven to be highly successful, not only for our school, but for the law school. And it has opened the doors to great partnerships between the two schools. And this joint degree program is only going to grow, and it's largely because of the work that John DiPippa has done, and I'm immensely and personally grateful. To introduce him today is the most well-known DiPippa in the world. Because you see, when the Clinton School needed a face or an identity, there is one name that everybody knows. Because of all these public programs, because of all these emails, because of all these press stories, the one name that is identified with the Clinton School is the name Nikolai DiPippa. He is everybody's best friend. Someone asked me the other day, was I launching Nikolai DiPippa's political career? I said, well, his name ID is higher than most politicians would ever hope to attain already. But he's done a fabulous job in working on this program. And you know, I think with a name like Nikolai DiPippa, I go by his office all the time. He has a bunch of nicknames. I won't go through all the nicknames, but don't you? I think Nikolai DiPippa sounds just like a great Italian restaurant. I just think it's. I keep telling him I want to invest in his restaurant. He's a pretty good cook, as is the whole family, by the way. But more importantly, he's a graduate of Hendrix College. He is an extraordinary young man in many, many ways. Loves sports, loves athletics, but has this remarkable and unique ability of just getting along with everyone. And if there is anyone that would win the best liked category around this school, clearly it would be Nikolai DiPippa. So we're honored that he's a member of our staff. We're pleased to work with him, and he's done an incredible job in making these programs successful. So to introduce his dad, would you welcome Nikolai DiPippa?
Thank you, Dean Rutherford. When Skip and Patrick asked me to introduce today's speaker, I was at a loss for words. There's so many things I could say, there's so many things that everybody wanted me to say. Where do I start? For many of you from the law school, you look to my left and you don't recognize him. He's not used to being dressed up, to say the least. So when he started his sabbatical at the Clinton School in January, the Philadelphia Eagles were making their playoff push in the NFL. It was the Friday before the big game, and he came in wearing his Brian Westbrook Philadelphia Eagles jersey over his dress shirt and tie. At 4 o'clock, he trots down to Dean Rutherford's office and asks him, "Where's the tailgate party?" From what I gather, Skip was more than a little confused. He's sitting there trying to process the event. Here's the Associate Dean of the Academic Affairs at the University of Arkansas Little Rock William H. Bowen School of Law, the new Clinton Distinguished Fellow. Why is he wearing a football jersey, and why wasn't I invited to the tailgate party? Besides being a great father and friend, he's had a long and distinguished career as a constitutional law scholar and in life in public service. I'm so proud that he's part of the Clinton School. Dean DiPippa began his career working for the Legal Aid Society of Roanoke Valley in 1978 after graduating magna cum laude from Washington Lee University School of Law, eventually becoming the executive director of Blue Ridge Legal Services in 1988. He left Virginia to teach constitutional law in Little Rock and became the Associate Dean of the Academic Affairs at the Bowen School in 1991. He stepped down from that in 1993 to spend more time with their family. Having 4 boys between ages 9 and 16 was a little bit much We didn't make it easy on him either. One April, we visited the local emergency room 3 out of 4 Wednesdays. My mom works every Wednesday late night, so you can imagine the parenting conflicts I had. He became the Distinguished Professor of Law and Public Policy in 2000, and again the Associate Dean of Academic Affairs in 2001, positions he still holds. He was part of the inaugural faculty of the Clinton School and serves on its executive committee. He's been interviewed for the television over 100 times since 1983 and has appeared nationally on CNN 6 times. He's been interviewed over 30 times for ABC News National Radio. He's appeared in Time, Newsweek, New York Times, and here's one that I didn't know, 2 Japanese publications. A little over a month ago, former U.S. Attorney Bud Cummins spoke at the school about the firing of 8 U.S. attorneys. He was taught by my father. We've heard from the student, now let's hear from the teacher. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome John DiPippa.
Thanks, Nikolai. Just to fill in the Japanese radio and newspaper story, they asked you your age. And so when I told them my age, I asked if that qualified me as an elder, and they said, "Oh, yes, sir." And so I made sure I reported that to the kids that I was now an elder. Thank you, Skip, for your introduction. Thanks, Nikolai. I'm honored to be part of this program that Patrick and Nikolai, as Skip points out, so ably have run. I really don't belong to be in sort of the same company as the Syrian ambassador and the Malawian ambassador and Madeleine Albright, but that's part of, I think, the genius and the value of the Clinton School, is they give the city an opportunity to really shine. And so I'm very thankful to the staff and to Skip for giving me the opportunity to have a fellowship this spring during my sabbatical. But I want to make a special thank you to Tom Bruce. Tom will be stepping down as Associate Dean in a few months, probably to start another school somewhere, although he claims that's not his case. But Tom has always been supportive, and when I told him I was on sabbatical this spring and that I might need an office or someplace to hang out for a while, without hesitation he said, "We'll make you a Clinton Fellow, you deserve it." And so Tom, my appreciation and my thanks for everything you've done. The school has your indelible mark on it, and it's for the better. Thank you. When the United States Attorney Purge scandal first broke, the administration said repeatedly that USA's, United States attorneys, serve at the pleasure of the president. Now, that means the president can fire them for any reason or no reason at all. Indeed, some even suggested that any other arrangement might be unconstitutional. When Karl Rove spoke in the Clinton School series, he said that there would be constitutional problems if federal judges appointed U.S. attorneys. And in April 19th New York Times op-ed piece, a law professor, Stephen Calabrese, who's also a co-founder of the Federalist Society, asked, "Doesn't the Constitution specifically limit Congress's role in removal of U.S. attorneys to impeaching them or their superiors for high crimes and misdemeanors?" Well, I've thought a lot about those statements, and I've come to a humble conclusion. They're all wrong. The Constitution does not require U.S. attorneys to serve at the pleasure of the president. There are no constitutional problems with a federal judge appointing temporary U.S. attorneys, and Congress's role in the removal of U.S. attorneys is not limited to impeachment. Congress has the constitutional power to vest the appointment of U.S. attorneys in someone other than the president and can put conditions on their removal. Now, the pleasure of the president talking point is very powerful. Most people intuitively understand it because most people work under a similar arrangement. That is, they reason, if my boss can fire me for any reason, why can't the president do the same to the people who work for the president? But the legal system is fundamentally different from, and more important than, selling widgets for XYZ Corp. Of course, I discovered in law school widgets were some nameless thing that stood for no product at all. Now they actually stand for something. So what you see are a bunch of computer widgets up there. But in any event, the point is taken. The legal system, you can let my colleagues in. It's fundamentally different from commerce. The legal system pursues a noble ideal, justice, while the XYZ Corp's bottom line is to sell more and more widgets. Now, all of us have a stake in the fairness of the legal system. We are, in a very real sense, its owners. We only hire presidents to temporarily manage the legal system for us. So when the president makes a decision, it's on our behalf, not on his. So today I want to explain that Congress should only allow a U.S. attorney's removal on a showing of good cause. Now, serving at the pleasure of the president has its good side. A U.S. attorney who knows that he or she can be replaced at will is more likely to work very hard on the president's priorities, and that can be a good thing. We elect presidents for what they say they'll do. If the president is going to declare war on some crime or another, the U.S. attorneys will be on the front line of that war. But the harms of U.S. attorneys serving at the president's pleasure outweigh the benefit. As the Supreme Court said, it's quite evident that one who holds his office only during the pleasure of another cannot be depended upon to maintain an attitude of independence against the latter's will. And as Joseph Story, the first constitutional scholar and a Supreme Court justice, said, it's utterly impossible not to feel that if this unlimited power of removal does exist, it may be made in the hands of a bold and designing man of high ambition and feeble principles, an instrument of the worst oppression and the most vindictive vengeance. So when Chief Justice Marshall in 1803 said that we are a government of laws, he expressed the fundamental truth of our constitutional system. Our system is established not from God, nor does it consign its power to one person. Rather, in our constitutional system, power comes from the people and is distributed across the branches of government and between the states and the federal government. Such a government depends on the ruler's ability to distinguish law and policy from politics and personality. The U.S. Attorney situation shows what happens when lawyers stop policing the boundary and politicize law. The politicization of law is now the frame within which all Department of Justice decisions are seen. And the decisions that prosecutors make are never easy and are often controversial. When people have confidence in the rule of law, they can accept even the most difficult decisions. But when people lose confidence in the rule of law, their willingness to comply with the law deteriorates. Now, cases are dismissed every day. Defendants are indicted or acquitted every day in federal courtrooms. But now, these decisions are seen in a completely different light. The political frame undermines the credibility of all 93 U.S. attorneys and the entire Department of Justice. As Bud Cummins said when he was here a few weeks ago, once you lose your credibility, people question every decision you make, and the Department of Justice, frankly, lives on its credibility. Politicizing the Department of Justice has a corrosive effect on everyone's belief in the rule of law. For the rule of law to work, it depends on our cooperation and our trust. If that breaks down, then we can no longer be a government of laws. Thus, the fight over the U.S. attorneys is more important than partisan politics, and the harm is more significant than declining public opinion polls. At bottom, it is a fight over what kinds of constitution we have and how the government uses its constitutional power. And the harm from making a bad decision will be significant and lasting. Now, the Bush administration's attempt to exert this unprecedented control over the Department of Justice and the United States attorneys is part and parcel of a larger theory of presidential power, known as the unitary presidency theory, that the administration has vigorously propagated. This puts the USA scandal in line with things like signing statements, torture memos, extraordinary renditions, secret prisons, unlimited detentions, denial of habeas corpus, expanded executive privilege, warrantless wiretapping, and so forth. When the Department of Justice slipped into the Patriot Act a provision that allowed the Attorney General to appoint interim U.S. attorneys indefinitely, they weren't just fixing a minor flaw. They were embedding the unitary presidency into law. Simply put, the unitary presidency theory is incompatible with the rule of law. But don't take my word for it. Even its proponents admit that. Last week, Professor Harvey Mansfield wrote a piece for the Wall Street Journal entitled, "The Case for the Strong Executive. Under some circumstances, the rule of law must yield to the need for energy." Mansfield argues that the rule of law has two defects, each of which suggests the need for one-man rule. The first defect is the law is universal, and therefore inferior in particular cases to the living intelligence of a wise man on the spot. The second defect is that the law must be enforced by energy in addition to reason. This leads Mansfield and others like him to argue that the president is not only above the law, but he's beyond it as well. Listen to what Mansfield says. "The best source of energy turns out to be the same as the best source of reason, one man, or to use Machiavelli's expression, uno solo, will be the best and greatest source of energy if he regards it as necessary to maintaining his own rule. Such a person will have the greatest incentive to be watchful and to be both cruel and merciful in correct contrast and proportion." According to Mansfield, quoting, "We are talking about Machiavelli's prince, the man in whom in apparently unguarded moments Machiavelli called a tyrant." Now in this view, the president has complete and unfettered power to do whatever he wants in military matters. He can spy on whoever he wants, detain whoever he wants, torture whoever he wants, because as Richard Nixon aptly put it, who'd have ever thought Richard Nixon could aptly put something? But as he aptly put it, if the president does it, it's not against the law. But it doesn't stop there. Even in ordinary matters, according to unitary presidency enthusiasts, the president's energy trumps Congress. Thus, the president can choose which parts of validly enacted laws to ignore, which judicial decisions to follow, and what information to withhold from Congress. And apparently, he can fire U.S. attorneys simply because he can. Remember Kyle Sampson's words in the December 2006 email, "What's the point of having this power if we don't use it?" So the real danger of the U.S. Attorney scandal then is that it propagates the myth of this all-powerful presidency. Now, to its adherents, it's only natural the president should be able to fire anyone in the executive branch. That's why the early response from the Justice Department seemed so incredulous. The president has complete power, and anything we do is legal. What else was there to say? In my view, if we adopt unitary presidency theory and everything that goes along with it, we will deform our constitutional structure. The framers wanted a strong executive, but not an all-powerful one. Now, perhaps the election cycle will mitigate the most extravagant claims of unitary presidency theorists. The danger, though, is that bits and pieces of this theory will be embedded in law. And that means we have to treat the U.S. attorney situation as a symptom of a much larger disease. We can't depend on the inherent goodness of this president or any president to do the right thing. To paraphrase James Madison, if we were angels, we wouldn't need government. But if we have non-angels running the government, then the trick is to give them enough power to govern, but enough control over them to control the governors. So we should set up structures that make it easier to do the right thing and harder not to, that involve all the branches of government and provide a level of public accountability. So here's the plan. Initial U.S. attorney appointments will still be made by the president, subject to Senate confirmation. And interim vacancies will still be filled by the federal judges for a temporary period of time. But the next step, that all USAs will be appointed for a definite term of office, either 4 years or until the term of the president who appointed him expires, whichever is less. Once confirmed by the Senate, U.S. attorneys cannot be removed before the end of that term, except for good cause. So that's the plan. But just having a good idea doesn't make it so as a matter of constitutional law. So the question is, does the Constitution require U.S. attorneys to serve at the pleasure of the President? Because if the Constitution does, then Congress can't impose this good cause standard. Well, let's begin with the Appointments Clause. The Appointments Clause, which is paraphrased up there, essentially sets up two kinds of federal officers. It says there are some federal officers that will be known as principal officers, who must be appointed by the President and approved by the Senate. But then the Appointments Clause contains this curious little phrase, the Congress may by law vest the appointment of such inferior officers, not necessarily bad, but subordinate to someone, as they think proper in the President alone, or in the courts of law, or in the heads of departments. So if we have these two different offices, their appointment and their removal can be different. So if the U.S. attorneys are principal officers, then they serve at the pleasure of the President. But if, as I believe, they are inferior officers under the Constitution, then Congress can control both their appointment and condition their removal. Now notice the Appointments Clause that we've seen is silent about removal. It just talks about appointment. Quick history. There's almost no debate about this at the Constitutional Convention, and the earliest mention of something about removal was during the first Congress, when the first Congress was trying to set up the Department of State. And the debate there was whether or not they had to explicitly say that the Secretary of State was removable by the President. And eventually, James Madison leading the argument, they concluded, no, the power to appoint somebody carries with it the power to remove them. This became known as the Decision of 1789. And that held until the Civil War. When Andrew Johnson became president after Lincoln's death, he inherited a hostile Congress, hostile to him at least. He hit rough water because of his sympathy for the defeated South and his tepid approach to the rights of newly emancipated slaves. Congress wanted to control Johnson's ability to change cabinet members. So they passed the Tenure in Office Act, which prevented Johnson from removing Senate-approved members of the cabinet, and in particular, in the specific case of the Secretary of War, prevented Johnson from removing him before the expiration of Johnson's term. Johnson vetoed the bill, Congress overrode it, Johnson defied the veto, fired Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, Congress impeached Johnson for that act, acquitted him on one vote. That was the whole basis of the Johnson impeachment. And it set the stage for an increasing level of congressional involvement in federal hiring and firing decisions. That held for about 75 years. In 1919, a case called Myers versus United States, the postmaster's widow sued for back pay. Postmaster Myers had been appointed to a term of office. He was removed, but the statute said that he could only be removed with the consent of the Senate. He was fired by President Harding. Who knew that Harding could actually do something? He sued for the remainder of his salary, and the Supreme Court said, no, you're entitled to that salary you're not entitled to that salary because executive officers serve at the pleasure of the President. They discredited the Tenure in Office Act and essentially adopted what they thought was the Decision of 1789. It sounded like the end of the story. 17 years later, though, the Supreme Court goes in a different direction. In a case called Humphrey's Executor versus the United States, the Supreme Court held that Congress would specify a term for and limit the removal of FTC commissioners. Humphrey's Executor involved another dead government employee suing for back wages. William Humphrey was appointed an FTC commissioner by President Hoover. The Senate confirmed him in 1938 for a 7-year term. In 1933, FDR asked for Humphrey's resignation, saying that the aims and purposes of the administration with respect to the work of the commission can be carried out most effectively with personnel of my own selection. Humphrey delayed, and Roosevelt sends him another letter where he says, "You will, I know, realize that I do not feel that your mind and my mind go along together on either the policies or the administering of the Federal Trade Commission, and frankly, I think it's in the best interest of the people that I should have a full confidence." This apparently is the New Deal version of loyal Rosies, or loyal Bushes, I suppose. Humphrey refused to resign. Roosevelt removed him. Humphrey didn't accept his firing. He died, and his executor brought suit to recover his salary from his firing in October to his death in February. And the Supreme Court here said, no, you're entitled to your money. The court said that postmasters were different from FTC commissioners because these commissioners acted as quasi-legislators or quasi-judges. Postmasters had to serve with the president, but FTC commissioners did not. Myers only applied to purely executive officers. It goes no further. So if you read Myers and Humphrey together, the court seems to be setting up two groups of appointees. Purely executive appointees, and then people who have quasi or mixed or blended powers. But this proved to be a very difficult distinction to make in practice, and the court abandoned it entirely in a case called Morrison versus Olson. Now, there are some interesting connections here. Morrison involved a challenge to the authority of an independent counsel. Congress created the Independent Counsel Law, called the Ethics in Government Act, after Watergate. The Morrison case grew out of the Reagan administration's refusal to turn over certain documents to a congressional committee, controlled by Democrats. After this controversy played itself out, the committee claimed that Ted Olson, then an assistant AG, gave false testimony about the documents. Eventually, an independent counsel was appointed. The Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of the Independent Counsel Law. For Chief Justice Rehnquist, the issue was simple. If the independent counsel was a principal officer, the act's unconstitutional. But if he's an inferior officer, all the removal and appointment provisions are constitutional. And Rehnquist spends little time discussing the difference, because the independent counsel clearly fell on the inferior side of the line. Rehnquist said there are four characteristics of inferior officers: limited tenure, limited jurisdiction, limited duties, and in this instance, the person could be removed by the Attorney General. All of these things show the independent counsel's subordinate or inferior status. And interestingly, in this case, the Supreme Court approvingly cited lower court, federal court cases that held that U.S. attorneys were inferior officers. So the court completely abandons this Myers and Humphrey dichotomy. And they say what this case is really about isn't rigid categories, but whether the restrictions Congress imposes interferes with the president's Article II powers. Power to be the executive, power to take care of the laws to faithfully executed. Now, some executive branch officials, then, are clearly so closely connected to the president that they must serve the president's pleasure. The Attorney General, the Secretary of State, the heads of the cabinet, the ambassador to the United Nations, all those people are, in very real sense, the president's agents who act on the president's behalf as president. But everyone else, according to Morrison, falls into this inferior officer category, and Congress has some control over their removal, so long as they don't impair the president's constitutional functions. Now, Justice Scalia wrote a dissent, and it's interesting for two reasons. First of all, it clearly lays out the unitary presidency theory, but also provides some ironic support for what I'm saying. Justice Scalia says, nothing is so politically effective as the ability to charge that one's opponents and his associates are not merely wrong-headed, naive, and ineffective, but in all probability crooks. And nothing so effectively gives an appearance of validity to such charges as a Justice Department investigation, and even better, prosecution. 10 years after Morrison, the court refined its definition of inferior officers to say that anyone whose work is directed and supervised at some level by someone who is appointed by the president. is an inferior officer. Anyone who is supervised or directed by a principal officer counts as an inferior officer. So, how does that apply to U.S. attorneys? I don't know that you can see much of that, but think about the standards here. They're appointed to limited terms, they have limited or at least circumscribed authority, their work is directed and supervised by officials in the Department of Justice, they follow Department of Justice guidelines, they can only act within their jurisdiction, and they have limited policy-making ability. Is it any wonder, then, that the lower courts have unanimously held that the U.S. attorneys are inferior officers, and in so doing upheld the authority of federal judges to temporarily appoint U.S. attorneys to fill vacancies? And most recently, the Eastern District of Arkansas, on March 16th, reached the same conclusion. So if the USAs are inferior officers, then Congress could give their appointment to some other branch. I think that's going too far. But clearly, in my view, Congress could limit their removal to the well-known legal standard of good cause. That would provide at least a level of public accountability for the removal of U.S. attorneys. In the end, U.S. attorneys must be loyal to the rule of law first and to the president second. George Tenet's recent book provides an object lesson in misguided loyalty. Tenet's book exposes the Bush administration's war on terrorism and against Iraq as dishonest, shallow, and incompetent. He claimed that his hair was on fire prior to 9/11, but that no one would listen to his warnings, and that he knew the case for a war in Iraq was thin at best, but that he couldn't get the administration to change its course. And yet, he stayed on. He helped Colin Powell prepare the UN speech that clinched the drive to war. Now imagine what would have happened if he had resigned and gone public with his reservations. How many Americans and Iraqis would still be alive today? His loyalty was misplaced and misguided. He owed loyalty not to the man who gave him his job, but to the people of the United States from whom he received his authority. The Department of Justice expected the same kind of misguided loyalty from the U.S. attorneys. One of Klaus Sampson's criteria for effective service, remember, was whether or not the U.S. attorneys were loyal Bushies. And that apparently meant more than that they generally supported the president. Rather, this kind of loyalty was meant to harness the Justice Department to the cause of one man and one party. If we are a nation of laws, then public officials who swear to uphold the Constitution owe it their primary allegiance. We cannot confuse the man with the office, or the party with the government, or the ideology with the Constitution. When it seems that the government is more interested in prosecuting its political opponents than doing justice, we have a right to be fearful. Now, U.S. attorneys need to be good team players. Bud Cummins was certainly that. But they also need to have a degree of independence and discretion commensurate with their responsibilities. U.S. attorneys like David Iglesias, who stood up to political pressure, should be held up as role models and not smeared as absentee landlords. U.S. attorneys like John McKay, who advocated for additional resources to investigate the murder of his first assistant, and who refused to prosecute weak public corruption cases, should be rewarded and not punished. U.S. attorneys like Bud Cummins, who remained loyal to the system and to his colleagues, should be promoted and not farmed out. And U.S. attorneys like Carol Lam, who chose to go after the most dangerous criminals, as opposed to padding her record with politically popular convictions of smaller fish, should be praised and not vilified. Now, we've seen the good kind of loyalty before. Many of you will remember that October 1973 weekend when Richard Nixon fired Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox in what became known as the Saturday Night Massacre. Nixon ordered then Attorney General Elliot Richardson to fire Cox. Richardson refused and resigned. His deputy, William Ruckelshaus, also refused and resigned. The task then fell to Robert Bork, the Solicitor General, who willingly obeyed. The country was outraged. This episode led to the first impeachment resolutions being filed against Richard Nixon, but I don't think the impact of Cox's firing would have been so dramatic had it not been for Richardson and Ruckelshaus, both good and loyal Republicans, who put loyalty to their country above loyalty to their party. Would that Kyle Sampson and Monica Goodling and all the other loyal Bushies in the Department of Justice had them as mentors instead of Alberto Gonzalez. Thank you.
Officer distinction. There are executive agencies like the Federal Communications Commission, whose commissioners are appointed by the President for a fixed term. But from what I understand, their the ability to remove them is subject to some statutory conditions. Since those persons that I know of don't report to someone who's appointed by the President, are those statutory conditions on their removal consistent with the Constitution?
That's a good question. I think that I'm going to give a lawyer's answer. The problem is Morrison seems to think that they fixed the problem and put everybody into this category. So at best what you have to say is, are there functional restrictions on the president's ability to be president by not allowing him to remove FTC commissioners except for good cause? And if you look at it that way, no, the president can still do all the good things the president does. Just because he can't remove Michael Powell as an FCC commissioner doesn't mean he still can't be commander-in-chief and execute the laws faithfully, etc. So really what Morrison seems to say is, if it's impossible for the president to exercise his presidential powers, the removal restrictions are unconstitutional. And if that's how you read Morrison, it's a very narrow group of federal officials who are serving at the pleasure of the president, and 99 out of 100 federal officials are inferior officers. Anybody else? Don't let me call on you. There'll be a quiz.
What is the normal attrition rate by administrations over the last 40 years of U.S. attorneys?
I don't know what the attrition rate over the last 40 years has been. I know for the last 25, at least from the beginning of Ronald Reagan's term, 3 U.S. attorneys were fired. Now, many of them leave in the middle, but only 3 were actually forced out. Most of them served the entire term of the president. It was 4 years in the first George Bush, or 8 years with Clinton and Reagan. And to give you an example of the sort of misconduct that would get U.S. attorneys fired, in 1996, the U.S. attorney in Miami came out that he was involved, he used to frequent, shall we say, exotic dancing clubs. And that wasn't bad enough, that he was using his credit card, and then it got even worse because he was then accused of biting one of the dancers. He was forced out. As Bud Cummins said here when he was speaking, it was the day that Kyle Sampson was testifying. And he was asked a similar question, like, what would it take to remove you? And he said, well, you know, nobody ever told me anything was wrong with my performance, but Kyle Sampson is testifying right now, and for all I know, he has a picture of me biting a prostitute. But the point there is, it took an awful lot to get a president to fire a U.S. attorney, because the precedent has been for presidents to be very careful about appearing to interfere in the operation of the legal system.
John, if your theory is correct, to implement it, Congress only has to pass legislation.
That's right. That's all you have to do. It's just a matter of congressional legislation. Because the Appointments Clause says, as Congress determines, clearly within congressional power to do so.
When Janorino replaced all the 93, was that's just earlier ones, and that's different than what's happening now?
Yeah, again, the historical, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
My second question is, I'm not a legal person, I'm a geophysicist, but this firing furor looks like a bunch of this tit-for-tat Democrats versus Republican junk that we have so much that I'd like to see done with. And
let me answer the first question. It's also said that, well, Bill Clinton fired all 93 prosecutors, and that's true, but then so did the first George Bush and Ronald Reagan, etc. The practice has always been, essentially, when the new president comes in to give the president an opportunity to set his team. But it's different from once they're in place, the president removing them during their term of office. And that's where this was exceptional, because 8 on one day versus 3 over the past 25 years, that's a clear disparity that asks for some explanation. Second question about tit for tat. I think there's some of that, but it seems to me that the larger question really goes to, as I said, Madison's point about building structures in the Constitution to insulate things like this from the political tit for tat. And if you had some sort of mechanism where every time a president wanted to remove a U.S. attorney, he had to justify it, it would at least require presidents to tread more carefully before they do that. It would give less of an opportunity for partisan politics to play a role in anything.
Thank you for your talk. Do you think, as a constitutional scholar, whether or not Congress decides to do so, that the president and his administration have committed an impeachable offense by the removal of these lawyers?
From what I know now, the answer would be no. But then we don't really know how much involvement the White House had and at what level the involvement was. Again, from what we can tell now, the president did not seem to be engaged in the actual firing of these. But, to give you an example, if the president turned to Karl Rove one day and said, let's fire that Iglesias guy, or let's fire Carol Lam because she's getting too close to Duke Cunningham, or let's pay $1.5 million signing bonus to Deborah Yang so she stops investigating Jerry Lewis, then we're talking impeachment. I don't think it's ever going to go that far. I think this, as Bud Cummins pointed out, is more a product of a sort of mindset among people in the Justice Department who had connections to the White House than it is pervasively at the very top of the White House.
I have a problem with the stopgap nature of what you would like to do with the unitary presidency. Because it seems to me that you're right about the idea of the unitary presidency, but the problem grows from the fact that we no longer have the structure of government that's in the Constitution of a president and appointed heads of department. What we have is the unappointed, or at least ratified by the Senate, White House advisors that essentially control both policy and politics. And I'm wondering what your suggestion for dealing with that, or do you think it's a problem?
I can always count on Ken. Yes, I think it's a problem. My solution I haven't thought through clearly enough. However, the principle would hold the same here. As inferior officers, first of all these unelected, unappointed people exercise significant federal authority. Therefore, they count as officers of the United States. If they count, they're going to have to be inferior officers according to this setup. And Congress can control their appointment. If Congress decided that all these unappointed, unelected advisors had to be approved by the Senate, Congress could do so. So I think it comes back to there's a legislative solution if there were political will to do so. And that might be the most, in my view, the most appropriate solution.
I wonder if you could speak a little bit to the other side of this problem. We've been talking about the removal of attorneys. What about the ones that stay? Is there any allegation or any problem with the reasons they were allowed to stay in office?
Well, you know, it's a good question about what about the ones who stayed. And it goes back to the point I made about the frame now that all decisions by U.S. attorneys operate under. And so there are lots of questions, and I listed several of the issues involving U.S. attorneys who have stayed that now make you wonder, well, why are they there? And there's something out of Wisconsin where there was a pre-election conviction of a lowly Democratic official that was reversed reversed on appeal. I think what's happened, though, is that there may be fire underneath that smoke. The problem is everything now looks like smoke. And what used to be ordinary sort of controversial prosecutorial decisions look really bad. Let me give you one recent example. It's hard to keep up because things happen every day, but the most recent example involved the U.S. attorney, her name is Deborah Yang, and I can't remember which district in California she came from. She was investigating Republican Representative Jerry Lewis. Last September, in the middle of the investigation, she announces that she's leaving. She goes to Ted Olson's law firm in Ted Olson's section, appropriately managed crisis management. She takes a $1.5 million signing bonus to go to the law firm. Who knew that lawyers got signing bonuses, people? We're in the wrong profession as teachers. But you only get a signing bonus if you bring big business with you. Well, who's she bringing as a U.S. attorney? Drug dealers? Coyotes? What business would a firm like Gibson Crutcher, Dunn, get from a U.S. attorney, and why would they pay her $1.5 million? Now, maybe they're just really bad with their money, but it looks awfully bad. And so you're going to see more and more of these questions being raised. Back to the Wisconsin issue. Most people have said that was just an aberration, that people who knew the U.S. attorney in Wisconsin vouched for him, and everybody makes mistakes. And this was a mistake, and it got reversed on appeal. That's the way it should be. But there are lots of other things now that just don't look good. And it really is undermining the morale and the ability of the U.S. attorneys to do their job.
We have time for one or two more questions.
John, I think your points are excellent, and I think your proposal is a good one.
Of course it is.
You should be aware that what follows is
There's a but, yeah.
However, the same concern that you raise about these things perhaps all looking nefarious because we can't tell the difference between the good and the bad, at least motivates me to suggest some caution. For example, many of my friends have gotten signing bonuses at large law firms. Gibson, Dunn, and Crutcher routinely gives signing bonuses, and Deborah Yang is an outstanding attorney who could bring enormous amounts of business to that law firm. So I suspect that perhaps there is an alternative explanation, although I don't know.
There might be, exactly.
So I caution you in that regard.
Thank you for your caution. But let me add, I think there is an argument to be made, by the way. Justice Scalia makes this. I think there's some validity to it. That in fact what you see happening is exactly the way the system should operate. And that is, people who overstep their authority and misuse it pay political consequences. And the Bush administration is paying the political price for what is perceived to be an abuse of power. And Justice Scalia would say that's the way it should be. We just have to have patience that it will work out that way. And I think there's some validity there to that. It depends on a lot of other things. It depends on an aggressive media who report these things. It also depends on a true Congress that is willing to do oversight. But if all those things are in place, then the system operates well. My plan is, let's at least put something in place where we can all agree on why we're doing these things. And then we can argue about what $1.5 million means and not. In the middle of an investigation, maybe she should have waited.
So now when you have U.S. attorneys removed and you have this smoke cloud covering the people that are replacing them, are we getting puppets that are loyal to the administration, or are there good people coming in who might be labeled now that if we don't have provisions similar to your plan, you're going to have this thing going on and on and on. They'll be removed, and then the others will be removed.
I think that's the worst thing about the situation is that most of the U.S. attorneys are very good lawyers, very good people, and deserve the jobs they have. But no matter how good they are and how well qualified, the cloud hangs over their repercussions too, if they were appointed in this way, or for that matter, if they were appointed by this president. And so that's where the real harm has come. And again, when Bud Cummins was speaking, that's where he got most eloquent about the damage it was doing to his colleagues who were still doing their jobs, because they found it increasingly difficult to escape the unfortunate public scrutiny that was coming because of the scandal.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's hear it for John DiPippa. Great dean, a great professor, and a great colleague, and an absolutely fascinating subject that is of high importance to those of us in Arkansas. Thank you for joining us at the Clinton School, and we will see you soon.